Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard and this is Lap of the World. Today we are going to be replacing the roughly 12-year-old KW Variant 3s on our first generation NSX with some brand new ones. Stick around. Before we jump into the actual work, I wanted to mention that this is going to be a two-part video series. This part is going to be the actual mechanics of getting a set of coilovers onto and off of a first generation NSX. The second installment in the series is going to be a 12-year review of the KW Variant 3 system, in which we will actually objectively test how dead or not they were after 12 years and something like 100,000 miles of mixed road and track use. If that video is already up by the time I publish this one, it'll be linked in one of these upper corners. I'll go back and put that card there as well once it's completed and published, in case you found this one first and are interested in that. But for now, let's get to, first of all, removing coilovers from an NSX, which is honestly the hard part, and then we'll go back the other direction. Here's what you're going to need to accomplish this task, moving from top to bottom, left to right. The toolkit that comes with your KW suspension, a torque wrench, which you will need eventually, and then starting with the wrenches, we needed a 14mm and a 17mm box wrench, bonus points of the 17mm ratchets. A magnet on a stick will come in handy in one specific case, number 2 Phillips or JIS screwdriver, 10, 12, 14, and 17mm sockets, a 6mm Allen wrench, a couple of extensions, a couple of sizes of ratchet, a breaker bar, and lastly, a 3 to 4 foot length of 2x4. I should say those tools are in addition to the obvious stuff like a jack stands, and the appropriate socket to remove your lug nuts, because step one is to remove your wheels. Starting up in the front, because I feel the front is the trickiest end to do, we're going to get up top here. You're going to remove these 3 covers from these 3 holes to gain access to the top bolts for the top hats. The next thing that we need to do in our specific case is remove our totally functional brake cooling scoop here to get access to the bottom bolt that holds the damper to the lower control arm. If you only have the much smaller stock plastic deflector there, you may not need to remove it. The next thing we're going to do while we're in the wheel well is disconnect one end of the sway bar, either the left or the right side. You don't have to do both. We have the opposite side disconnected, so we'll leave this side alone. But you will need the extra articulation to actually remove the front damper from the lower control arm. And if you have the sway bar hooked up, it's going to be very, very difficult or potentially impossible. The last thing we're going to want to do before actually disconnecting the damper from the car is we're going to want to disconnect the brake line from the damper. There's one 12mm bolt, and then the brake line can just kind of sit there out of the way, although you will want to be careful of it. With our brake line now loose, we can start the process of removing the damper from the car with undoing the main 17mm bolt and nut combination down here that holds the damper to the lower control arm. If you're removing the stock suspension, removing this bolt from the bottom hole can be fairly tricky because the stock suspension is naturally longer than the coilover setup that I've got on the car. In that case, I would recommend going ahead before you start the process and using some spring compressors to compress the control the spring on your stock suspension, and that should give you the wiggle room that you need. You saw me kind of lean on the brake rotor there to push the suspension down a little bit to remove the load from the bolt and easily remove it. Moving up top, the next thing we need to do are remove these 3 bolts that hold the top hat on. They're pretty easy to get to, however this process will probably answer one of your questions about why we needed one of the tools that I showed earlier. So as you get to the top of the stroke, you want to very carefully remove your ratchet, and I found it's easiest to take your rare earth magnet and do the last turn and a half, and that way you're certain not to drop the nut down under the cowl, in which case you're going to have to fish for it with the magnet anyway, and this just sort of removes the middle of that process that can be annoying. Last key point up here, you do not need to undo. In fact, I would discourage you from undoing this top nut at this point. So at this point, your spring and damper assembly or coilover is just kind of sitting in there in position, just held in place by the tension of the bushings on your front suspension. And this is where the you're going to need that 2x4. So what you're going to do is you're going to wedge your 2x4 in here where it is going to be levering off of this upright, about where that mounting bolt is there. You're not going to dent anything there. And then the bottom of it's going to be levering on the lower control arm. And what this is going to let you do is swing this suspension down out of the way, which will let you remove the bottom of the damper from its little mounting pocket right there. If you don't lever the suspension down, you can't get the clearance you need to get this thing out and off to the side where you can remove it. So just to be clear, the move here is we're going to take this control arm and we're going to press it down. Then we're going to pick this up out of the way and move it across this way, being careful of our brake line, and let it drop down into this space between the control arm and the tie rod, and that will let us angle it and remove it. This is one of those places where a second set of hands could come in handy. You could have somebody else lever the suspension while you wrestle with the damper assembly, or you could leave it to somebody more limber than you to wrestle with the damper assembly while you just put your foot on a 2x4 and add pressure on demand. Moving to the rear of the car, the process back here is nearly identical to the front with a couple of small differences. The first thing you're going to want to do in the rear is remove this, what everybody calls the rear window garnish, aka engine vent, aka coil wrecking water inlet trim piece here. And with that out of the way, you will have access to your top nuts. The next thing that's different in the rear has to do with the sway bar. Whereas on the front we could just disconnect it from an end link. In this case we have to remove the entire end link because the top bolt on the top stud on the end link doubles as the through bolt for the bottom of the damper right here. You have to disconnect it from the sway bar first because you need the articulation to remove the rather long bolt. This is where you need your 6mm Allen to key into the stud on the bottom here, and then your 17mm, ideally a ratcheting wrench, to undo the nut. To facilitate undoing the nut from the other side of this bolt, when there's a ball joint on this end, there are a couple of flats that are machined into these into the end links right here, and that will fit a 14mm box wrench to keep that from moving while you undo the other side. So now with the end link / bottom bolt out of the way and the top bolts undone as well, this is where we need to bust out our 2x4 again. We're going to use leverage a little bit differently back here. We don't need as much. This will not require as much pressure as it did in the front. And we don't want to really lever against anything over here because that's like your crank, pulley, and oil filter. So what instead we're going to do is we're going to kind of come across the top of our heat shield here and put the 2x4 up here. Now the move you're going to make with the damper assembly is it's going to go back. Like you're going to push the bottom of it inboard, because there's space to remove it from its cradle that direction this time. It doesn't have to come straight up. Or rather, the control arm doesn't have to go straight down to accomplish this. So you're going to kind of go back to the side and down is going to be the move to, that's kind of how you're going to get it loose and free. Again, mind your brake line on the way out. So now that we have these things off the car, the next thing we're going to do is transfer our measurements. Now I had the car corner weighted at some point in time previously, so these ride height settings should be hopefully what I want on the new setup as well. I did stop and confirm, I'll put a picture on the screen here, that the overall dimensions of the new design KW coilovers is the same as the old design KW coilovers. But we're going to kind of remove any other design changes if if the threads stop at a different place or something like that. We're going to remove that from our equation when we're transferring our measurements. I'm just going to put a little 3/8 inch extension as a bolt surrogate through here. And then I'm going to slightly misuse a dial caliper here, and I'm going to go from the bottom of the spring perch where I can get a square measurement. And then I'm going to come down here to, my bolt surrogate extension. Make sure we're all square. And once I've got that all square, I'm going to lock that in place, and then I will just use that measurement to set the spring perch height on the new coilover. For those of you who don't have measurements to match, I'm not going to leave you hanging. We're looking at about, this will get you, should get you close. And if you match them side to side, the NSX is pretty well balanced. So this should be good enough until you can get the car corner weighted if you're going to go that direction. But from the bottom of the spring perch on the fronts, from the bottom of the spring perch to the top of the bolt here is like 10 3/8 inches in freedom units. I'll try and do a metric conversion on the screen. And for the rears, again, from the bottom of the perch to the top of the bolt, we're at like 8 3/4. So the last thing we're going to do here before we move on to outfitting our new coilovers is since we reused the top hat, we need to remove the top hat. Now, if you were doing this on a stock suspension, so you need to reuse your top hat off of your stock suspension, for the love of all that's holy, use spring compressors. Otherwise, you're going to fire this thing across the room and potentially directly into your eyeball. With the coilovers, because you have the little helper spring down here that kind of doesn't have a lot of tension on it, but just takes up the slack here, it's not as big of an event. At least with these, if you're undoing KWs to go to something else, you can use a, what is this? 8 millimeter to hold the shafts still. And then a 17 millimeter to pop these loose. All right, yeah, see with the coilover, because you don't have as much tension because of the helper springs, it's not as much of an event. Had I done that with the with a stock damper and spring, the damper would have probably gone through the wall over there, and this would have ended up, on my drill, bouncing off the drill press over there. But now we have recovered our top hat, and you do want to make sure that this little sleeve, closer view here, you do want to make sure that the sleeve that goes through these bushings comes off with the top hat. I've seen those kind of stick in place. So as you can see, this one in particular of mine was pretty crusty and took a little bit of extra encouragement to detach it from the damper piston. So I elected to go ahead and replace them all with this kit from Science of Speed. You have to order 2 of these. They come as a pair. You have to order 2 pair then to get the full set. But it comes with new polyurethane bushings, new sleeves, and new washers. Before I completely forget, 2 more items that you're going to want to keep track of that can get lost in the disassembly process. This washer that goes on top of the top hat. This sits here and is the washer for the top nuts on the coilover. All right. There is another washer that will go on the bottom side that fits around the shock piston. Goes right there. So as we continue kind of setting up our top hats here, we've installed our SOS polyurethane bushings and their new sleeves. The next thing I'm going to do is swap out these old rubber top pads, I guess is what I'm going to call them. So if you are starting from stock, you won't have these on here. These are intended to act as a centering ring for your coilover spring collars. And when you look at these, there is a, you'll have, if you get them jumbled or discombobulated, let me show you close. if you get these jumbled or discombobulated, you should know that there should be 4 of them, 1 for each damper that has like a short side on it. There are others of these where it's got the long side on both sides, but this one has a short side on one side, and that's intended to nest into the rubber top bushing here while still not making contact with, let me show you this close up here. You want to still have a gap between this like nylon plastic stuff and I think probably like FRP, because it looks like it has a little fibrous stuff in it. You want to have a gap between this and the metal on the top hat when you finish this installation. If you don't have that gap, if the plastic is touching the metal, you probably have this upside down or you're using the wrong one. The next thing we're going to do is actually replace this top pad. Again, I could reuse these, they are kind of intact, but they're rubber and they've been on the car for 10 years, and as we all know, rubber has a shelf life. It's pretty intuitive how they go on. The new ones have these little scallops on the edges here. You can see the scalloped edges there, and that keys into these, the bottom of these studs right here. Once we have our physical dimensions set on the coilover with our spring perch height, the last thing we want to do is actually set them up from a damping standpoint. So you've got this little tool that you're going to put in here. Please note on the KWs, it may be different with others. But on the KWs, your rebound is on the top here, or it's on the piston, and your compression or bump adjustment is at the bottom here with a little thumb wheel. This is actually way easier. I'll cover this in the other video where we talk about design changes, but way easier to set these up, at least from the bottom on the new ones, because it's now open on both sides for adjustment on the car. So I'll put some settings on the screen here that came from our resident racing driver, Billy Johnson. If you want to see, he has a YouTube channel, One Lap Billy, if you want to see him flogging a lot of exotic machinery, often to track record speeds around some tracks in California. I'll leave a link to that in the description. But I think the baseline settings he was recommending here are spot on from my experience anyway. So with our baseline ride height settings and damping adjustments dialed in here, we're going to start to put things back together before it goes back on the car. Step 1, your bottom washer, if you were reusing it, or your new bottom washer. That's going to go over here and sit back down on the flange on the piston. The next thing we're going to put on is this ring. That's going to sit there. Now we have our new rubber centering ring / bushing and our new bushings and our top hats. That's going to go on next. Now you do want to make sure when you're putting this on that this flange on your top spacer actually fits in and centers on this damper. Otherwise it's going to make putting it back together more difficult. Now that we've got everything sort of in line, the next thing we're going to do is you're going to grab a washer and one of the top nuts in one hand, and you're going to use your other hand or potentially a spring compressor or helper to drop the top washer on here. And then you can kind of put your weight on it a little bit and at least get this top guy started, as this one's going to be difficult, of course, but there we go. So to tighten things down, you're going to need a 17mm crescent wrench and a small torque wrench set to about 20 Newton meters or 15 foot-pounds per the KW manual, at least on this kit. At this point, installation is just the reverse of disassembly. You're going to use the opposite of the same moves you use to get the coilovers out to put them back in. Yeah, you're probably going to need your board as a lever again, and you can even reuse your magnet to get the top nuts started before you put the socket on them to again avoid having to fish for them under the plastic cowling. And it's torque spec time. Top nuts, 32 foot-pounds. Bottom bolt, 69 foot-pounds. Sway bar end length, 62 foot-pounds. Brake line attachment, 7 foot-pounds. If applicable, brake scoop bolts, also 7 pounds. Please note, if you've gone from a stock spring and damper to a coilover or changed to a different coilover setup, then you will at least need an alignment at this point. If you also plan to corner balance the car, do that first, then get the alignment. Depending on your final ride height, you may also need to explore camber compensation options, as you will gain negative camber as you lower your car. Alright folks, well we are down to just putting the wheels back on and going for a quick test drive to make sure everything is buttoned up nicely for our next road trip and racetrack adventure. If you enjoyed this video or found it at least informative, if not entertaining, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this, as well as when we are again getting out in the world and checking more racetracks off of our list. If you found it useful, leave a like. Also leave a comment if there are any tips or tricks to this process that I missed, or let me know how your own install went and what suspension option you decided to go with. KW is one of many choices for these early NSX. It happens to be my preference, but you know, mileage may vary depending on what you're doing with your car. But with all that said, again, thank you for watching. I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and we will see you all in the next video, if not at the track.